Have you ever wondered what separates the honest worker from the daring thief? One obeys the system, the other dares to rewrite it. Yet both are chasing the same thing, freedom. And sometimes that pursuit begins quietly. A street glows faintly under the orange light of an old lamp. A man stands across from a bank, hands tucked in his pockets, watching the stillness of the night. He isn't thinking about chaos or fame, only the door, that locked, silent barrier between him and everything he's ever wanted. For centuries, people have dreamed of crossing that line, to touch what's forbidden, to outsmart the systems built to protect it. The story of theft is in many ways the story of money itself. Wherever wealth gathers, curiosity follows, and where there is trust, there is someone wondering how to break it. The first great bank robbers were not hardened criminals. They were craftsmen, workers, dreamers, men who believed that money moved too slowly, that it hid in too few hands. Their tools were simple: keys, ropes, horses. Yet behind every heist was something ancient and human, the same restlessness that built cities and toppled empires. Over time, money changed shape. It turned into numbers, passwords, invisible codes of trust, and the thieves changed with it. They traded tunnels for screens, pistols for keyboards, blueprints for algorithms. But the heart of the act, the reach for something out of bounds, remained the same. Every heist tells two stories, one about crime and one about us, about the systems we build to hold our hopes and the lengths we go to when those hopes feel just out of reach. Because in every locked vault and digital firewall lies a reflection of human nature, our desire to control, to create, to possess. This isn't a story of villains or heroes. It's a story of invention, desperation, and the fragile idea that money, this thing we've made to measure our worth, can ever be truly safe. If you stay with this journey, you'll see that every heist reveals something deeper, about power, trust, and what we're willing to risk for freedom itself. So if you crave stories that challenge how you see money, ambition, and the quiet rebellion inside us all, subscribe, because what comes next isn't just history, it's a mirror, and the reflection begins here. Chapter 1: The First Great Robbery. It began not with a gunshot, but with a key. In the winter of 1831, New York City slept under a gray sky. Horses clopped over cobblestones slick with rain, and gas lamps burned dimly against the wind. Inside the city bank on Wall Street, the night guard walked the same slow path he'd walked 1,000 times before, unaware that the history of modern crime was about to begin. The thief was a man named Edward Smith, though history remembers him only faintly. He was not a killer or a bandit from the countryside. He was a locksmith, a quiet man who understood how metal spoke. He knew the rhythm of tumblers, the patience it took to listen to them click into place. When he looked at a locked door, he didn't see steel and barriers. He saw possibility. One cold evening, Smith used a stolen key to slip inside the city bank. No one saw him. No one heard him. He moved by lamplight, careful not to breathe too loud. In those days, banks were not fortresses. They were little more than rooms of oak and iron, guarded by faith and routine. Inside, stacks of coins lay neatly arranged, waiting for morning. By dawn, over 245,000 was gone, a fortune beyond imagination at the time. When the clerks arrived, they found the vault open, the air still cold from the night. No broken doors, no shattered glass, just emptiness, quiet and complete. The news spread through the city like smoke. People gathered outside the bank, whispering that the world had changed. For the first time, money, that symbol of safety and order, had vanished without force. It was taken with intelligence, not violence, and that frightened people more than any gun ever could. Police searched every corner of the city. They printed descriptions, questioned workers, followed trails that led nowhere. But Smith had disappeared into the crowd. He lived quietly, spending his fortune slowly, almost respectfully. There was no getaway horse, no gunfight, no betrayal. Just a man who'd unlocked something no one else had dared to touch. The illusion that wealth was ever truly secure. When Smith was finally caught years later, much of the money was still hidden. He admitted little. His crime had not been born from hunger or revenge. It was born from curiosity, from the simple desire to see if he could do it. That, perhaps, is what made it so haunting. The Citibank robbery was the first of its kind in America, the first great act of financial imagination. It marked the moment when theft evolved from brute force to quiet precision. Before that, robbery was a matter of speed and courage. After Smith, it became a matter of intellect. Money in the early 19th century was physical, heavy, and slow. Gold coins, paper notes, and ledgers kept by hand. The system was built on trust more than technology. Banks were temples of belief, places where people placed not just their savings but their sense of security. When Smith broke that trust, he didn't just steal wealth, he stole a feeling, the comfort that money was safe once it left our hands. There's a strange poetry in how it happened. No one was harmed, no one even woke up. The entire theft took place in silence, as if time itself had paused for him to work. It's easy to imagine him standing in that quiet vault, the lamplight flickering across brass coins, his reflection in the steel door. Perhaps he felt wonder, perhaps guilt, perhaps nothing at all. But beneath that silence lay something larger, the birth of a new kind of human thinking. The idea that systems, no matter how grand, could be studied, understood, and outwitted. It was the same kind of thinking that built railroads and factories, that wired cities and invented machines. The thief and the engineer were not so different. Both looked at the world and thought, there must be another way. In the years that followed, the legend of the Citibank robbery spread. It became a story told in newspapers and taverns, a warning about human cleverness. Other thieves studied it, learning from its simplicity. Bankers learned, too. They built thicker doors, hired more guards, invented new locks. The cat-and-mouse game had begun, and it would never end. What makes this first great heist so memorable isn't the amount stolen, but the feeling it left behind. The unease, the realization that no lock is perfect, no system unbreakable. For the first time, people began to understand that money, though solid in form, was fragile in trust. That's what lingers in the story of Edward Smith, not the coins he carried away, but the question he left behind. If everything we depend on can be unlocked by someone else, what are we really trusting? Every great heist that followed, every vault tunneled beneath, every train derailed, every server hacked, would carry that same shadow, the same curiosity, the same quiet rebellion against the limits we build around wealth. And it all began in that small New York bank, on a winter night, with a man who simply wanted to see what was possible. He didn't change money, he changed the way we looked at it. Chapter 2: The Great Gold Train. It was a gray spring morning in 1855 when a train left London carrying boxes of gold bound for the port city of Folkestone. The train was long, heavy, and quiet, a machine of iron and smoke moving through the mist. Inside the wooden wagons, the gold sat locked in sturdy safes, each sealed with wax, watched by guards who trusted the weight of steel more than their own eyes. No one on that journey imagined that somewhere between the stations, between the sound of the wheels and the rhythm of the tracks, the world's first great railway robbery was already in motion. The Great Gold Robbery of 1855 was not a moment of chaos. It was a symphony of patience. It began months earlier in a London workshop where three men, Edward Agar, William Pierce, and a railway clerk named Burgess, studied the system they hoped to break. They didn't have blueprints or maps, they had observation. Pierce worked within the railway, a man of charm and quiet influence. Agar was a master of locks, known for his delicate hands and clever mind. Burgess, the insider, held the keys to the movement of gold. Together, they saw what few others noticed, that the most secure transport in England ran not behind fortress walls, but along open countryside. The gold shipments traveled regularly from the Bank of England to the coast, where they would be ferried to France. The route was predictable, the guards complacent. Security relied on trust in the railway's routine, trust in the men who handled the boxes, trust in the seals that marked them as untouched. That trust would soon be broken with quiet precision. The plan unfolded like a craftsman's design. Agar, the locksmith, managed to make perfect impressions of the safe's keys using wax and patience. Pierce secured their cooperation with railway workers and learned every detail of the shipment schedules. Burgess provided access from within, knowing when the safes would be placed, how the guards rotated, and where the gold would lie. They didn't need violence, they needed timing. On the night of May 15, 1855, the train departed as always. Somewhere along the line, as it rumbled into darkness, the three men acted. They used duplicate keys to open the safes, replaced the heavy gold bars with lead shot packed to match the weight, and resealed the boxes with care. Every move was calculated, every motion slow. When the train arrived at its destination, the safes appeared untouched. The guards reported nothing unusual, and the gold, 24 boxes of it, was already gone. It took days before anyone realized what had happened. When the boxes were opened in Paris, there was silence first, then disbelief. The gold was gone, replaced by dull gray metal. The seals were intact. The locks were undamaged. It was as if the treasure had evaporated in transit. Newspapers called it the crime of the century. But the truth was simpler and more haunting. It wasn't magic, it was method. The investigation that followed was slow and uncertain. The police searched for broken locks, forced doors, missing men. They found none. The thieves had left no trace except for a few pieces of twine and the weight of embarrassment on the faces of powerful men. For months, the gold seemed to have disappeared into the fog of England itself, but greed, as always, left small cracks. Agar, one of the masterminds, was later arrested for a separate crime. While in prison, he feared that Pierce would abandon his lover and child. Promises of care that had been made with stolen gold. Angered by betrayal, Agar confessed everything. He described the plan in perfect detail. The keys, the timing, the lead shot, the calm of that night on the train. The story astonished the public. No dynamite, no chase. Just the sound of a train rolling through fog, and the steady hands of three men who believed they could outthink the system. The Great Gold Robbery revealed something new about crime and money. It showed that wealth had become mobile, no longer locked in vaults but moving across landscapes, vulnerable in motion. It was a reflection of its time, the age of industry, when everything from goods to people began to move faster than ever before. With speed came opportunity, and with opportunity came the possibility of loss. The story of that train is more than the story of theft. It's the story of how technology changed trust. In a world of steam and steel, people began to believe in machines. The tracks, the timetables, the telegraphs, these were symbols of progress, but they were also blind spots. The thieves saw what the system could not. That complexity often hides its weakest points in plain sight. There's a quiet irony in it. The gold was meant to serve commerce, to oil the machinery of empire. But for a brief moment, it became part of another story, one about human imagination and daring. The men who stole it were not celebrated for long. Pierce was caught, tried, and sentenced. Agar's confession made him infamous, not rich. Burgess faded into obscurity. The gold itself was never fully recovered. Yet the echoes of their crime outlived them, carried forward in every story of stolen trains, missing shipments, and the eternal question of how security ever truly works. If you listen closely, you can almost hear that train still. The rhythmic sound of iron wheels over wooden tracks, the soft hiss of steam, and somewhere in the darkness, the faint clink of a key turning in a lock. It's the sound of confidence turning to doubt, of certainty undone by intelligence. The thieves were not heroes, but they were mirrors, showing us that every system built for control invites its own undoing. By the time the century ended, money had become even more abstract. Paper notes, bank drafts, telegraphs transmitting value through invisible lines. The robbery on the rails seemed almost quaint, but it was a beginning, a moment when human cunning met human invention and found its balance. The thieves didn't just take gold, they took the illusion that progress makes us safe. Every generation since has repeated their act in new forms, through wires, through screens, through silent codes and passwords. The gold has changed shape, but the question remains the same. How much do we trust the systems we build, and how much do we understand the people who build them? The Great Gold Robbery of 1855 wasn't simply about greed. It was about curiosity and the belief that even in the most secure world, there is always a door waiting to be opened. And as the train disappeared into the gray horizon, no one on board knew that history had shifted, that beneath the quiet rhythm of its wheels, a new kind of crime had just been born. Chapter 3: The Wild West and the Rise of the Outlaw. In the dust of a new America, when towns were no more than wooden signs along endless plains, the sound of a distant train meant everything. It was the heartbeat of a nation still finding its rhythm, carrying gold, mail, cattle, and dreams. The railroads were veins of progress stretching through the wilderness. But where there is treasure in motion, there is always someone watching, waiting, thinking, why not me? The West of the late 1800s was a land of contradictions. It was both freedom and lawlessness, a place where a man could build a fortune or lose his life in the same week. Banks sprouted in small towns as fast as saloons, filled with the hard-earned savings of miners, farmers, and merchants. There were few rules, fewer policemen, and long stretches of open land where escape was always possible. It was the perfect stage for a new kind of criminal. One who didn't hide in the shadows, but rode in plain sight under the sun. His name was Jesse James. He was born in Missouri, raised during the Civil War, and learned early that violence could be both a tool and a language. When the war ended, men like Jesse, former soldiers with no home and no peace, looked at the railroads and the banks and saw opportunity. The lines that carried wealth from east to west became invitations. The banks, symbols of distant power, became targets. And so the outlaw was born. Jesse James wasn't the first to rob a bank, but he was the first to turn it into a legend. In 1866, he and his gang rode into Liberty, Missouri, on a quiet afternoon. The town was small, its people trusting. They entered the Clay County Savings Association like ordinary customers. Moments later, they left with thousands of dollars and a dead man lying on the floor. It was shocking not because of the violence, but because it happened in broad daylight, in the heart of a town that believed itself safe. For the first time, robbery wasn't done in secret. It was performed like theater. Word spread quickly through newspapers, and the story took on a strange life of its own. Some called Jesse a murderer, others a folk hero. The line between the two blurred with every retelling. The West was full of men who had lost faith in distant institutions, railroads that took their land, banks that foreclosed on their farms. To them, Jesse wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing it back. Each robbery became a story of defiance, and the man himself a symbol of rebellion. But behind the myth was something simpler: survival. The James gang lived hard, always moving, always one step from capture. They robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains, striking with speed and vanishing into the wilderness. They planned with care, studied schedules, learned which shipments carried gold. They knew the land like hunters, and the law could never quite catch their scent. They used the terrain as their ally. The woods, the caves, the long stretches of prairie where no telegraph could reach. As the robberies continued, the legend grew. Newspapers fed it, embellishing every detail. The public wanted stories, not facts. They wanted heroes in a world that felt uncertain. The railroads were growing stronger, the banks richer, the land less free. Jesse James became the face of resistance. A man who refused to bow to progress, who took from the powerful and gave nothing back. It didn't matter that he kept the money for himself. The myth was already stronger than the truth. But myths are fragile things. The same fame that protected Jesse also doomed him. As the years passed, the gang grew smaller. Arrests, gunfights, betrayals. One by one, the names disappeared. The world around them changed too. Telegraph wires connected towns, lawmen rode faster horses, rewards grew larger. The outlaw who once seemed untouchable became a hunted man. In 1882, in his own home, Jesse James was shot by a member of his own gang. Robert Ford, a man promised pardon and a bounty. The folk hero fell not to justice, but to betrayal. His death was mourned like that of a fallen king. Crowds came to see his body. Songs were written. Stories passed from town to town, each one softening his crimes and sharpening his legend. In time, Jesse James became less a person than a symbol. Of rebellion, of independence, of the restless American spirit that could not be contained. The banks and trains he robbed became part of the nation's growing myth of itself, a story where even the thief could be noble if he seemed brave enough. The rise of the outlaw changed more than the stories people told. It changed the way they thought about money and power. Banks were no longer untouchable temples. They were vulnerable, human, fallible. Each robbery was a reminder that the system, no matter how strong, could be challenged by a single man with courage and cunning. It was both terrifying and strangely liberating. But beneath the romance was tragedy. Most outlaws died young, shot, betrayed, or hung. Few kept their gold long. Their lives were short sparks against the vast emptiness of the plains. Yet for a brief moment they held something the rest of the country longed for: freedom. Not the kind written in laws or ledgers, but the kind felt in the wind, in the gallop of a horse, in the instant before the gunfire began. By the end of the century, the wild frontier began to fade. Railroads connected every major city. Telegraph lines carried news faster than riders. The West was no longer wild. It was mapped, measured, and managed. The outlaw spirit that once roamed its open lands had nowhere left to hide, but its echo remained. In the songs, in the legends, in the stories people whispered about men who dared to take what others feared to touch. Looking back, the outlaws of the West seem almost innocent compared to what came next. They lived in a world where theft was physical, where the sound of a gun and the thud of hooves marked every crime. They faced their risks face to face, with no disguise but dust and courage. Theirs was the last era where money still felt heavy, where gold and paper had weight, and where a man's worth could still be carried in a saddlebag. The story of Jesse James and the rise of the outlaw wasn't just about greed or fame. It was about the uneasy birth of a new kind of world, one where progress created both opportunity and loss. The railroads brought wealth and order, but they also brought distance and control. And for a moment, men like Jesse reminded the world that even in a system built on speed and precision, a single unpredictable human heart could still disrupt it all. As the 19th century closed, the trains kept running, faster, heavier, carrying not just gold but the new lifeblood of a growing nation. The era of the outlaw was ending, but the idea of the perfect crime was only beginning. Somewhere far across the ocean in the heart of Europe, another kind of thief was already watching and waiting, one who would trade horses for automobiles, dust for gasoline, and pistols for dynamite. And the age of the modern bank heist was about to begin. Chapter 4: The First Modern Bank Heist. Paris, 1907. The city hummed with quiet sophistication. Electric lamps glowed on wet streets. Carriages rolled beside early motorcars, their wheels tracing silver reflections across the Seine. It was the dawn of a new century, elegant, confident, and full of invention. But in the shadows of its progress, a different kind of innovation was taking shape. A new breed of criminal was emerging, intelligent, organized, and unafraid to use modern tools. The era of the outlaw on horseback was fading. The age of the professional thief had begun. At the center of this transformation was the Société Générale Bank, a symbol of France's growing financial power. It stood on Rue Ordiner in northern Paris, solid and imposing, a fortress of stone meant to hold the wealth of a city that believed in reason and order. It was designed to withstand force, but not imagination. The men who would challenge it were not bandits in dusty hats or soldiers turned rogue. They were thinkers, craftsmen, and idealists. Their leader was a man named Jules Bonnat, a former chauffeur, a skilled mechanic, and a believer in anarchy. He belonged to a group of radicals who called themselves Les Bandits Tragiques, the tragic bandits. They didn't steal for greed alone. They stole as a statement, a rebellion against the growing machinery of capitalism. In their minds, banks were not sacred institutions. They were prisons of wealth, built by the powerful to contain the freedom of others. Bonnot was fascinated by machines. He understood engines the way earlier thieves understood locks. He could take apart a motor car and rebuild it from memory. Where others saw a vehicle, he saw a weapon. Fast, efficient, unstoppable. And so one gray morning in December 1911, Bonnot and his men brought something entirely new to the history of crime, the getaway car. They arrived at the Société Générale just as the clerks were opening for business. Their plan was quick, precise, and silent. Inside, the men produced revolvers, ordering everyone to the ground. No chaos, no shouting, just a calm efficiency that made the air colder. Within minutes, they emptied the drawers of cash, filled their sacks, and stepped outside. The sound that followed changed the course of history, the growl of an automobile engine echoing down the narrow Paris streets. The police, still arriving on horseback, were left staring at clouds of exhaust. The world's first motorized bank robbery had just taken place. The newspapers couldn't look away. The motor bandits, they called them, astonished by the speed and precision of the crime. The police were humiliated. For the first time, the law was slower than the criminal. Horses could not catch engines. Word spread across Europe that a new kind of thief had appeared, one who understood not only courage but technology. Bonnot's gang had done more than steal money. They had stolen the future. Their success didn't last long. Paris became a city under siege. Policemen raided safe houses, factories, and garages. Posters with the bandits' faces hung on walls and cafes, but Bonnot wasn't the kind of man to hide. He continued his robberies, each one bolder than the last. He attacked payroll wagons, targeted armored transports, and vanished through the streets before the authorities could respond. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a dark symbol of freedom. The machine against the system that built it. Bonnot's end came as dramatically as his life. In April 1912, surrounded by hundreds of policemen and soldiers, he barricaded himself in a workshop near Paris. The standoff lasted hours. Gunfire echoed through the streets, smoke filled the air, and by evening, Bonnot lay dead among twisted tools and shattered glass. The city breathed a sigh of relief, but beneath that relief was a strange unease, because everyone knew that what he had started could not be undone. The first modern bank heist wasn't remembered for how much money was taken. It was remembered for what it revealed. That technology had forever changed the balance between power and defiance. The tools that built society could also be turned against it, and the intelligence that created machines could also learn to manipulate them. The robbery at Société Générale marked a turning point when crime became industrial, precise, calculated, and aware of the systems it opposed. There was poetry in it, too. The thieves were products of the very world they resisted. They used engines forged by progress, weapons crafted by factories, and ideas shaped by cities that promised equality but delivered hierarchy. Their rebellion was both personal and symbolic, an argument against the growing sense that life itself was being mechanized. The banks represented order, while the bandits represented chaos. And between them lay the fragile space of human ambition, always torn between creation and destruction. In the years that followed, their methods spread like sparks. Across Europe and America, new gangs studied their tactics. They learned about timing, coordination, escape. They saw that success no longer depended on bravery alone, but on knowledge, of routes, of engines, of systems. The modern thief became less of a fighter and more of a planner. He could wear a suit, speak softly, and understand mathematics. He was no longer an outsider. He was a reflection of the world's own complexity. Banks, too, evolved in response. They built thicker walls, installed electric alarms, and hired guards with revolvers. But the arms race between money and ingenuity had already begun. Every lock inspired a key, every vault inspired a plan. Humanity had entered a loop it would never escape, inventing security, then inventing ways to break it, over and over again. It's easy to imagine Bonnot in his final days, looking out at the Paris streets and sensing the shape of the future. Cars becoming faster, cities becoming brighter, money turning into invisible signals passing through cables. He would have understood that the real battleground was not the street or the vault, but the human mind, the endless game between control and imagination. He would have known that his crime was just a glimpse of what was coming, a century where theft would no longer need a weapon or a wheel, only an idea. The Société Générale heist was a mirror held up to modernity. It showed that progress, no matter how noble, always carries its shadow. Every innovation creates its own form of risk. Every new layer of security invites a mind clever enough to undo it. And perhaps deep down that's why we find these stories so fascinating. They remind us that perfection is impossible. That somewhere, hidden within every system, there's a flaw waiting for someone to find it. In the quiet after the gunfire, when Bonnot's body was carried away, Paris returned to its rhythm. The lights of the city glowed once more. Banks opened. Trains ran. People went back to work, pretending that the world was safe again. But in the corners of every financial institution, a new fear lingered. The knowledge that the future belonged not only to those who built systems, but also to those who dared to question them. And so, with the death of one man, the world stepped into a new age. An age where crime would evolve alongside technology, each advancing the other in an uneasy dance. The first modern bank heist had ended, but its echo was only beginning to spread. Chapter 5: The Great Depression and Desperation. The 1930s opened with silence, the kind that follows a collapse. Banks that once glowed with marble and confidence now stood like hollow shells. Their doors were locked, their windows dark. People gathered outside, waiting for answers that would never come. Money, once a promise, had turned into a rumor. In that silence, a new kind of desperation was born, one that would give rise to the most haunting and strangely human heists in American history. The Great Depression was not just an economic crisis, it was an emotional one. Overnight, the system people believed in, the banks, the markets, the steady rhythm of work and reward, dissolved. Families lost homes, farmers lost land. Men who had built railroads and factories stood in bread lines, staring at their hands as if they no longer belonged to them. Hope became a luxury, and in the spaces where hope disappeared, other forces grew. Hunger, anger, and the quiet belief that fairness had died. It was in this world that the new generation of outlaws emerged. They didn't ride horses or wear masks. They drove Fords, carried Tommy guns, and posed for photographs with the same confidence as movie stars. Their names became folklore: Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, each one a reflection of the era. Desperate, fearless, and oddly glamorous in a time when everything else had lost its shine. John Dillinger was the first to turn robbery into performance. He wasn't a simple thief. He was a craftsman of chaos, a man who planned his crimes with precision and lived with a calm that bordered on grace. When he walked into a bank, he didn't shout or threaten. He smiled. He spoke softly. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed every step. Witnesses said he seemed almost polite, as if the robbery were just another kind of transaction. In less than 2 years, he robbed over a dozen banks, escaping every trap the law set for him. His success wasn't just skill, it was timing. The people no longer loved the banks, they had lost too much to them. So when they read about Dillinger in the papers, many didn't see a villain. They saw revenge wrapped in charm. Crowds gathered at his trials. Women sent him letters. Songs were written about his escapes. The press called him public enemy number one, but to the people, he was the man who outsmarted the system that had failed them. Then there was Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, two young lovers whose crimes felt like poetry written in blood and dust. They robbed small banks, gas stations, and stores, never stealing millions but always stealing attention. They were poor, restless, and in love. Photographs of Bonnie holding a rifle and smiling into the camera turned them into symbols of reckless freedom. They lived on the run, driving through endless miles of farmland and gravel roads, always one step ahead of the law. Their robberies were desperate, often clumsy, but their story, two young souls defying a broken world, made them immortal. Yet behind the romance was tragedy. They were hunted relentlessly, their every move tracked, their faces printed in every newspaper. When the end came, it was not poetic, it was brutal. On a lonely road in Louisiana in 1934, police ambushed their car, firing over 100 bullets. The metal glowed hot in the sun. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde ended in smoke and silence. But even in death, they remained symbols of something deeper. The longing for control in a world that had taken it away. The same year, John Dillinger met his end outside a movie theater in Chicago. He had gone to watch a gangster film, a story that mirrored his own life. As he stepped into the night, the air thick with summer heat, federal agents surrounded him. One shot ended the legend. The crowd that had once cheered him now stared as he lay on the pavement, blood mixing with the city dust. The man who had defied the system was finally claimed by it. In the span of a few years, the outlaws of the Depression became martyrs of imagination. They were not heroes in truth, but symbols of rebellion, of human defiance, of the fragile border between survival and morality. The newspapers that once condemned them soon turned their stories into myth. Hollywood followed, reshaping their crimes into tales of courage and tragedy. The Great Depression, in its bleakness, had created its own kind of theater. One where the robbers were not just criminals, but reflections of a wounded nation. What made this era of heists so haunting was not just the crimes themselves, but the hearts behind them. These were not men and women chasing luxury. They were chasing dignity, a sense that they still had power in a world that had stripped it away. Each gunshot, each escape was an act of protest, a way of saying, I still exist. The banks they robbed were more than buildings. They were symbols of betrayal. The same places that had once promised safety and then closed their doors when people needed them most. But time has a way of softening the sharp edges of history. What began as desperation turned into legend. The outlaws of the 1930s became part of America's mythology, a mirror of its contradictions, freedom and law, hope and despair, wealth and ruin. Their stories were reminders that every system built on trust can only hold so long before someone questions it. By the late 1930s, the era of the romantic bank robber was ending. New laws, faster communication, and coordinated police forces made the old ways impossible. The age of the lone outlaw gave way to something colder, more methodical, organized crime. The robberies became quieter, the faces less famous. The heist was no longer a rebellion, it was a business. Yet even as the dust settled, the echoes of that desperate decade lingered. The images of fast cars, fedora hats, and Tommy guns remained in the public imagination. They stood for something larger than crime. The idea that even when the world collapses, the human spirit still searches for a way to break free. The Great Depression taught the world many lessons about money. It showed how fragile wealth could be, how quickly trust could vanish, and how easily fear could change the shape of society. But it also revealed something about human nature, that beneath the laws and the ledgers, people are driven not only by greed, but by need, pride, and longing. In the end, the robbers of the 1930s didn't steal much compared to the fortunes lost in the stock market, but they stole something less tangible and far more lasting, the illusion that the powerful could never be touched. And as the world climbed slowly out of that long decade of dust and hunger, the banks would rebuild their marble walls once more. The vaults would close, the guards would return, and money would move again. But deep in the collective memory, the sound of engines roaring down empty highways would remain, a reminder that every system, no matter how strong, carries within it the memory of the moment it was broken. In Chapter 6, The Great Brink's Job. Boston, 1950. The winter air was brittle and thin, the kind that stings the skin and bites the lungs. Snow clung to the cobblestones like frost on iron, and the city seemed to breathe slowly under its white weight. Beneath that calm, something precise and extraordinary was about to unfold. Not the chaotic rush of a gunfight or a desperate escape, but a masterpiece of patience. It would be called the crime of the century, not for its violence, but for its perfection. The target was the Brinks Armored Car Depot, a squat gray building in Boston's North End. From the outside, it was unremarkable. No gleam, no grandeur, just function. Inside, it was a fortress. Steel doors, alarm systems, and thick concrete walls guarded the flow of cash that passed through daily. For years, armored trucks came and went, carrying the lifeblood of the city's commerce. Payrolls, deposits, coins, and cash. No one imagined anyone could touch it, and that was exactly why they did. The men who planned the Brinks robbery were not wild outlaws or desperate dreamers. They were craftsmen of crime, working with precision, discipline, and restraint. There were 11 of them in all, led by Tony Pino, a quiet, calculating man who saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. Pino had been studying Brinks for years, watching from shadows, mapping routines, noting every movement of the guards. He didn't want chaos, he wanted control. The plan took shape slowly, like architecture. The men learned how the keys were handled, how guards rotated shifts, and when the building held the most cash, they practiced their timing. They built tools to fit the exact dimensions of the locks. Every detail was rehearsed until it became instinct. No one spoke more than they had to. They trusted silence. On the evening of January 17, 1950, Boston was coated in a thin mist. At 6:55 p.m., the Brinks building glowed faintly under the streetlights. Inside, guards counted the day's deposits, millions of dollars in small bills and coins. Outside, 2 cars waited quietly, engines idling. 7 men stepped into the night, dressed in dark clothes, rubber gloves, and Halloween masks. Their shoes were wrapped in crepe to soften the sound. They moved like ghosts. At exactly 7:10, they used duplicate keys to slip through the side door. The timing was perfect. No alarms, no noise. Inside, the guards barely had time to turn before they were surrounded. No one was harmed, no shots fired. The robbers spoke calmly, instructing the men to lie down, warning them not to look. In less than 30 minutes, they loaded over 2.7 million, the equivalent of nearly 30 million today, into canvas bags, cash, coins, checks, every bill accounted for. By 7:40, they were gone. The guards, bound but alive, managed to sound the alarm minutes later. Police flooded the streets, but the robbers had vanished, leaving behind almost nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no evidence except a few strips of cut rope and some tape. It was as if the money had evaporated into the cold Boston air. For weeks, investigators combed the city. They interviewed dock workers, bankers, mechanics, and drifters. The FBI called it the most perfect robbery in American history. There were no witnesses, no clues, and no demands. The public was fascinated. Newspapers ran headlines that read like poetry. Invisible thieves strike Brinks. 2,775,000 vanishes without a sound. It was not just a crime, it was art. The men who pulled it off didn't celebrate. They didn't flash their wealth or leave traces. They hid the money, buried it, divided it slowly. They agreed to wait 6 years before spending a dime, long enough for the investigation to cool. It was a pact built on discipline and fear. For a while it worked. The Brinks job became legend. The authorities were left chasing ghosts. But time is the quiet enemy of all perfect plans. Years passed, and with them, patience began to thin. Some men grew restless, others careless. Greed, the slow poison, began to work its way through the circle. A few slipped up, talking too much, spending too freely, trusting too little. One man, caught for an unrelated crime, began to speak. Another betrayed a friend. The walls of silence began to crack. The FBI, sensing weakness, waited for the right moment to strike. In January 1956, exactly 6 years to the day after the robbery, the statute of limitations was about to expire. That morning, before the clock could run out, federal agents moved in. One by one, the Brinks thieves were arrested. The timing was poetic, almost cinematic. After years of silence, the law had caught its breath. Most of the men went to prison. Some died before serving their time. Only a fraction of the money was ever recovered. The rest vanished into legend, hidden somewhere under Boston's cold soil or spent quietly in the years between. The heist itself, though undone, remained untarnished in memory, a blueprint of precision, patience, and trust. What made the Brinks job extraordinary was not the money, but the method. It was a turning point, the moment crime became logistics. Gone were the days of reckless bandits and roaring engines. In their place came planners, engineers of theft who understood that the real weapon was knowledge. The Brinks robbers didn't break rules. They studied them until the cracks appeared. In its quiet way, the heist also mirrored the age it came from. The 1950s were years of order, schedules, structure, and routine. America was rebuilding itself on discipline. Suburbs grew in neat rows, corporations expanded, machines hummed with predictable rhythm. The Brinks robbers didn't just steal from a bank, they stole from that illusion, the belief that systems, once perfected, could no longer be broken. When people read about the robbery, many felt an odd mix of fear and admiration. There was no blood, no destruction, just the elegance of an idea carried to perfection. It felt modern, like the world itself was learning that power no longer belonged only to those who built systems, but also to those who could understand and bend them. After the arrests, one of the robbers reportedly said, "We almost had it. We almost made it to forever." It was true. For 6 long years they had been ghosts, invisible, untouchable, perfect. But time, as always, had the final say. The Brinks job remains a symbol of quiet genius, not of rebellion or greed, but of human precision at its most daring. It was a lesson written in silence, that no fortress is perfect, no plan flawless, and no trust eternal. And in the reflection of that truth, the world of crime took another step forward, from the wild chaos of the past toward something colder, smarter, and infinitely more complex. The men who walked into Brinks that winter night didn't know it, but they were marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The era of muscle and bravado was fading. The era of calculation had arrived. Chapter 7: The British Job. England, 1963. The summer air carried the faint smell of coal and wet earth, and the hum of trains still echoed across the countryside. Britain was changing. A nation caught between the shadows of post-war austerity and the bright confidence of a new modern age. The Beatles were beginning to sing, London was finding its rhythm again, and yet beneath the optimism, there lingered a familiar temptation, the sight of wealth moving through the world, just fast enough to make a man wonder if he could catch it. On the night of August 8, 1963, a train left Glasgow for London carrying more than letters. It was the Royal Mail train, its wagons filled with registered packages, cash, securities, and valuables bound for the capital. Among them sat 128 sacks containing over 2.6 million, the wages and savings of a working nation. The guards inside believed they were transporting trust itself. They didn't know that, miles down the line, a group of men were waiting in the dark, listening to the steady heartbeat of the rails. The leader was Bruce Reynolds, elegant, confident, and ambitious. He was no brute or desperado, he was a thinker. Around him he gathered a team of 16 men, drivers, safecrackers, mechanics, and muscle, each chosen not for loyalty but for skill. They studied the train's route for months, learning its every schedule, every habit. They learned how it slowed at signals, how it turned near bridges, and how the guard car was separated from the engine. To them, it wasn't just a robbery. It was an orchestration. Their plan hinged on a single act of deception, one red light on a quiet stretch of track near the town of Cheddington. The men climbed the signal pole days before, wiring it to glow red on command. At 3:03 a.m., as the Royal Mail train rolled through the darkness, the light switched on. The driver, following his training, slowed to a stop. The world went still. There was no sound except the faint ticking of the locomotive's cooling metal. Then from the shadows they appeared, men in masks, silent and swift. One climbed into the driver's cab and struck the engineer, knocking him unconscious. Others detached the engine and the first 2 wagons, leaving the rest of the train behind. The robbery itself was clean, quick, and methodical. They loaded the mailbags into waiting trucks under a pale moon, their hands steady, their movements rehearsed. Within 30 minutes they were gone. 120 sacks of cash in tow, the largest theft in British history. They drove south to a remote farmhouse in Buckinghamshire, where the real work began. Inside, they stacked the sacks like bricks, counting, sorting, dividing. 2.6 million in 1963 was an unimaginable fortune, enough to buy dozens of homes, fleets of cars, entire futures. For a few hours, in the flickering light of that farmhouse, they stood at the top of their own small empire. No guns fired, no blood spilled, just quiet triumph. But perfection is always temporary. The farmhouse, intended to be abandoned immediately, became their undoing. The gang stayed too long, eating, laughing, reading newspapers that hailed the Great Train robbery as a national sensation. They left fingerprints, scraps of food, and clues in their wake. Within days, the police found the hideout. The fingerprints told the rest of the story. The investigation that followed became one of the most intense in British history. Newspapers printed the robbers' faces as they were captured one by one. Reynolds, Biggs, Wispy, and others. Some tried to flee abroad, others surrendered quietly. But the legend was already bigger than the truth. The press called them gentlemen thieves. The public, weary from years of class division, saw them as folk heroes. These men hadn't stolen from the poor or the defenseless. They had stolen from the system. The faceless machinery of the state. For many, that distinction mattered. Still, the courts were unforgiving. The sentences were severe, 30 years for most of them. The judges wanted to make an example, to remind the nation that order still had meaning. Yet even prison couldn't kill the legend. 2 years later, Ronnie Biggs escaped, scaling a wall with a rope ladder and disappearing into the wind. His flight turned the heist into mythology. He fled to France, then Australia, then Brazil, living as a symbol of defiance. For decades, his name drifted through popular culture, in songs, films, and late-night conversations in pubs. The train robbery had become more than a crime. It was a story Britain couldn't stop telling. The Great Train robbery revealed something about the time it belonged to. It wasn't just a theft of money, it was a theft of control. The 1960s were a decade of change, of youth rising, traditions crumbling, and authority questioned at every turn. The robbers, in their strange way, embodied that rebellion. They were ordinary men who dared to test the boundaries of a rigid society. And when they succeeded, even briefly, it felt as if they had stolen not just cash, but possibility. But beneath the glamour, the story had shadows. The train's driver, Jack Mills, never fully recovered from the injuries he suffered that night. He lived quietly after the ordeal, haunted by it. Some of the robbers spent their later years poor, sick, or forgotten. Others never saw freedom again. The gold that once glittered in the headlines dulled with time, revealing what it had always been. Just money, fragile and fleeting. Still, the heist endures in memory. It marked the last great robbery of the old world, a crime rooted in flesh, steel, and movement. The thieves worked by hand, touched what they took, and risked their own bodies in the act. It was human in scale and human in error. After this, crime would evolve into something colder, less tangible, into networks, machines, and screens. But for one night in 1963, under a pale English sky, men and money still met face to face. There's an image that lingers from that night. The stopped train in the middle of nowhere, its headlights cutting through fog, the countryside still and timeless. Inside the silence, one can almost hear the quiet rhythm of history shifting, from the age of mechanical theft to the dawn of something invisible. The Great Train Robbery was more than a story of greed. It was a mirror held to a changing world, a moment when skill and daring briefly outpaced the systems built to contain them. And in that fleeting moment, the dream of freedom, however flawed, burned brighter than the rules meant to suppress it. Chapter 8: The Vaults Below London. In the early autumn of 1971, London pulsed with quiet confidence. The city was modernizing, concrete towers rising beside centuries-old churches, buses humming through fog, neon reflecting off the Thames. Money flowed like electricity, unseen but constant. Yet beneath the surface of this calm, far below the busy streets and polished glass, another kind of work was taking place. A team of ordinary men, patient and precise, were burrowing into history. The Baker Street robbery began with a whisper, not a plan. A man named Anthony Gavin, a photographer with a fascination for puzzles, began noticing something about the Lloyds Bank branch on Baker Street. The building was small and unassuming, but what mattered wasn't the ground floor. It was what lay beneath it. A vault deep underground, filled with private safety deposit boxes belonging to London's wealthy and powerful. Diamonds, gold, deeds, secrets, things worth far more than cash. And most importantly, Gavin discovered something extraordinary. The bank sat beside an empty shop that had a basement leading straight toward the vault wall. It was a perfect alignment, a coincidence so pure it felt like fate. Gavin gathered a small group of men, a locksmith, a car dealer, a shop owner. They weren't hardened criminals or gang leaders. They were meticulous tradesmen, practical and calm. Together they rented the shop next door, Le Sac, a small leather goods store, and began digging downward. They called it the tunnel, though it was more like a narrow grave, 3 feet wide, 40 feet long, and 10 feet deep. For weeks they worked in silence, descending through clay and stone with shovels, pickaxes, and determination. The ground was damp and heavy. Air was scarce. Every sound echoed through the earth like a heartbeat. They worked only on weekends when the city slept and the banks were closed. They used walkie-talkies to communicate, one man above ground to listen for police chatter, the rest below in the dark. At night, the tunnel glowed faintly from their lamps, a small ribbon of light buried under the weight of London. The smell of soil clung to their clothes. Their hands were cracked, their backs aching, but they kept digging. Inch by inch, week after week, until the day came when the tip of a drill bit finally struck metal. Behind that wall lay more than 500 safety deposit boxes, each one sealed, private, filled with lives built on wealth and secrecy. When the men broke through, they entered a silence thicker than air. The vault was timeless, untouched by noise or light. They moved methodically, prying open boxes, filling bags with jewelry, gold coins, cash, and documents. Some boxes held strange things, letters, photographs, hidden notes. They took what they wanted and left the rest. There was no violence, no alarms, no rush. Only the sound of locks being opened, one after another, in the deep stillness of the earth. But as they worked, something unexpected happened above ground. Late that Saturday night, a young radio enthusiast named Bob Rowlands was experimenting with his ham radio. As he tuned through the frequencies, he began picking up strange voices, men talking in short, careful bursts, words like drill, lookout, guard. At first, he thought it was a police training exercise, but when the conversation continued, he realized he might be listening to a crime in progress. He called the authorities. The police began searching for the source of the signal, driving from block to block through the West End, scanning the air. But the voices were faint, bouncing off buildings, hard to trace. They narrowed it down to a few streets, including Baker Street, and began checking every rooftop and shop. When officers reached Lloyd's Bank, everything seemed normal. The doors were locked, alarms quiet, windows intact. No signs of forced entry. Unsure what to make of it, they left. Beneath their feet, only a few yards below, the robbers worked on through the night. By Sunday morning, the job was done. The men packed their tools, sealed the tunnel, and vanished into the city. No alarms were triggered. No one knew anything had happened until Monday, when the bank opened as usual. The clerk descended into the vault and froze. Dozens of boxes lay open, their contents scattered like debris from another world. The air still smelled faintly of soil. The wall, broken cleanly through, revealed the tunnel's dark mouth. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the bank. The news broke that afternoon. The Great Bank raid screamed the headlines. Estimates of the stolen goods ranged from 1 million to 3 million, an immense sum at the time, much of it untraceable. The police called it one of the most extraordinary robberies in British history. But almost as quickly as the story spread, something strange happened. The press coverage stopped. Newspapers were told to drop it. Details were withheld, questions unanswered. Whispers spread that the robbery had touched the wrong kind of wealth, that certain boxes might have contained more than money. Rumors of blackmail, political secrets, and compromising photographs swirled quietly, then disappeared under official silence. The phrase "denotice" was whispered, an order from the government to suppress sensitive information. Whether true or not, the story faded from the front pages almost overnight. Still, the police continued their hunt. The investigation stretched on for months. Gradually, names began to surface. Gavin was arrested, along with several accomplices. They received long sentences, but the stolen goods, the diamonds, the cash, the secrets, were never fully recovered. Some said they were buried. Others claimed they were smuggled abroad. Even today, no one knows for certain what disappeared beneath Baker Street that night. The heist was remarkable not for its size, but for its intimacy. It was a crime of hands and patience, of earth and silence. The men had not stormed a bank or held anyone hostage. They had simply studied the world, found a crack in its foundation, and slipped through it. It was as though they had tunneled into the psychology of wealth itself, into the quiet spaces where people hide what they fear to lose. And perhaps that's why the story endures. The Baker Street robbery wasn't just about money. It was about access. The idea that even in a city as controlled and structured as London, the invisible could still be breached. The thieves didn't break into the world above. They came from below, from the ground itself, as if to remind the powerful that every fortress rests on soil that can be moved by human hands. When the city sleeps, the streets hum softly. Beneath them, the earth remembers. Somewhere in those layers of clay and stone lie the faint traces of that tunnel, the echo of picks and shovels, the whisper of voices in the dark. The vault has long been sealed, the walls repaired, but the question remains: how many secrets still lie buried there, locked away by silence? The Baker Street robbery remains one of the quietest and most haunting heists in history, not because of its danger, but because of its calm. It was a reminder that even in an age of machines and progress, the simplest tools, a shovel, a plan, and patience, could still humble the might of a city. And as London carried on, unaware of the earth that had been moved beneath its feet, the world above continued to build higher, faster, and stronger, never noticing how soft the ground below really was. Chapter 9: The Inside Job. Every system, no matter how fortified, depends on one fragile truth: trust. Locks and walls can guard what we own, but people are the real gatekeepers. They hold the keys, they know the codes, they understand the routines that machines never question. And sometimes, when belief cracks, the danger doesn't come from the outside. It comes quietly from within. The inside job is the oldest story in the history of money, and the most human. It begins not with violence or clever planning, but with disappointment, the slow erosion of faith. Somewhere between loyalty and need, a person decides to turn inward, to use what they know against the very system that trusted them. Unlike the masked robber or the hacker behind a screen, the insider already belongs to the place they will betray. That's what makes their story so haunting. They don't have to break in. They're already home. The 1980s offered a perfect landscape for this kind of crime. The world was growing more complex, more connected. Banks became vast ecosystems of people and data, running on layers of passwords and procedures. The money itself was no longer physical. It lived in ledgers, wires, and terminals. It was invisible, abstract, and strangely unguarded. And while new technologies promised security, they also created new temptations. The distance between access and control grew smaller every year. One of the earliest and most famous examples came from within the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In 1982, a man named Stephen Louis Price worked quietly in the foreign exchange department, a trusted employee who handled enormous international transfers every day. No one looked twice at him as he processed routine paperwork, moving millions between banks with a few strokes of a pen. But inside, something was changing. Price had debts, and more dangerously, a belief that the system he served could be played. He discovered small gaps, minor discrepancies that no one checked closely, and he used them. With a few falsified documents, he began diverting funds in small amounts, testing the edges of invisibility. For months, no one noticed. The system trusted its own rhythm too deeply. By the time the theft was discovered, hundreds of thousands had quietly vanished into personal accounts. There was no alarm, no chase, just the slow realization that the breach had been growing from the inside all along. But the inside job is not always about greed. Sometimes it's about ideology, about power, about revenge against a world that feels unjust. In the 1990s, a British employee of Barclays Bank named John Rusnak began manipulating foreign exchange trades. He wasn't stealing in the ordinary sense. He was hiding losses, creating a fictional world where the numbers balanced. At first, it was survival, a desperate attempt to correct a mistake. But soon it became a labyrinth of lies, an alternate reality built inside the heart of the bank itself. Every day he faked reports to cover losses, borrowing money that didn't exist, trading with invisible capital. He lived in constant tension, not for wealth, but for the illusion of control. When the truth emerged, hundreds of millions had been lost. His betrayal wasn't born from malice, but from the quiet terror of admitting failure. The pattern repeats through history in small towns and global capitals alike. The local teller who pockets cash from the till, the manager who reroutes a client's account, the systems analyst who copies data to sell in secret. Each begins as a whisper, a rationalization, just this once, just a little, I deserve it, they'll never notice. And yet, behind every act lies the same simple fracture. A human being deciding that the promise of honesty no longer matters. There's something chilling in how ordinary these betrayals are. They don't come from monsters or masterminds, but from people you could pass on the street. They drink coffee in the same break room, laugh at the same jokes, nod through the same meetings. And all the while, somewhere deep inside, a plan takes root. It grows in silence, watered by resentment or fear, until one day it steps quietly into action. Technology has only deepened the intimacy of the inside job. In the old world, theft required motion. A door opened, a vault breached, a getaway planned. Today, betrayal can happen from a desk in the glow of a monitor. One click, one line of code, one transfer request. The act itself takes seconds, but its consequences ripple outward for years. In 2009, an employee at Société Générale in Paris manipulated trading systems so deeply that the bank lost billions before the fraud was uncovered. He hadn't set out to destroy. He had simply found a way to cheat time, to fix what was broken before anyone could see. But time always catches up. The system, like the sea, eventually pulls everything to the surface. What makes inside jobs so haunting isn't just the loss of money, it's the loss of certainty. After an external robbery, a company rebuilds its walls, replaces its locks, installs better cameras. But when the enemy was trusted, repair is harder. How do you guard against belief? How do you fortify trust without destroying it? Some banks tried to answer by removing human hands altogether. Automation, surveillance, auditing systems that flag even the smallest anomaly, all designed to make the human role mechanical. Yet even machines need people to build them, to monitor them, to interpret what they see. And as long as a person stands somewhere in the process, the door remains ajar. The inside job reveals an uncomfortable truth about us. It shows that money, at its core, is not just a measure of wealth but of faith. Faith in systems, in colleagues, in invisible promises. When someone on the inside betrays that faith, the theft cuts deeper than numbers. It leaves behind doubt, a small crack in every future handshake. And yet, if we look closely, these stories also carry something profoundly human. The reminder that systems are never stronger than the people within them. For all our talk of progress and precision, we are still built from weakness, hope, and fear. We want security, but we crave freedom. We seek belonging, but we guard our own survival. The inside job lives at that intersection, where trust meets temptation. In the end, every betrayal begins quietly. A glance, a thought, a line crossed that no one can see. It's the soundless turning of a key in a lock that no alarm was built to detect. By the time the world notices, the damage is already done. And so the history of heists shifts again, away from the roar of engines and the blast of safes, into something smaller, subtler, and more unnerving. The enemy no longer wears a mask. He wears a uniform, carries an ID badge, and knows your name. He's not breaking in, he's already here. Chapter 10: The Technological Turn. By the end of the 20th century, money was no longer made of paper, metal, or weight. It was light. the weightless pulse of data moving through cables, through satellites, through invisible space. The world had shifted without ceremony. Banks were no longer vaults but networks. Transactions no longer happened across desks but across continents in fractions of a second. And like every revolution before it, this one carried its own shadow. The thieves of the modern world would not need guns or masks. They would need only knowledge and time. The technological turn began quietly, almost invisibly, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the first machines began to handle money for people. ATMs appeared on street corners like small metal promises. Open all hours, polite, efficient, unjudging. A card, a code, and the soft click of the dispenser. It felt like freedom. But every new door opens to both directions. For the first time, a person could steal from a bank without ever stepping inside. The earliest digital thefts were experiments, almost innocent in their simplicity. In New York and Los Angeles, computer hobbyists, young, curious, and reckless, discovered ways to trick systems into releasing cash by entering hidden codes or looping transactions. Banks were astonished. These were not professional criminals, they were kids, tinkering with technology that even the bankers barely understood. It was a new kind of frontier, a space where the rules of the physical world no longer applied. Then came the 1980s, when money became information. Credit cards replaced cash, databases replaced ledgers, and networks replaced walls. The act of stealing began to look more like programming. Criminals no longer needed to crack safes, they needed to crack systems. In 1983, a group of teenage hackers in Milwaukee breached a bank's computer network using a telephone modem. Their equipment cost less than a dinner for two. They didn't steal much. A few test accounts, some curiosity-driven data, but their discovery changed everything. The world realized that the next great robberies would be written, not wielded. Technology didn't just change how theft happened. It changed who could commit it. The new thieves were invisible, anonymous, untethered from geography. One person sitting in a dimly lit room could reach into the financial systems of another continent. In 1994, Vladimir Levin, a Russian computer scientist, discovered vulnerabilities in Citibank's global network. Using little more than his terminal and skill, he transferred over 10 million to accounts across the world. He was caught eventually, but his crime marked a new age. For the first time, a man could rob a bank without ever seeing it. The irony of this new world was that it looked cleaner, safer, more efficient. Banks boasted of paperless systems, secure transfers, and instant verification. But security is a feeling before it is a fact. As long as information could move, it could be intercepted, copied, or changed. And as money lost its shape, so did the boundaries of theft. What was once a bag of gold or a stack of bills was now a stream of digits, slipping silently from one account to another. The crimes became more complex. In the late 1990s, a group of hackers in Ukraine created a virus that infiltrated American financial institutions. It recorded keystrokes, passwords, and login data, sending it back through invisible routes. No alarms sounded. No one stormed vaults, but millions disappeared, drip by drip, over weeks. By the time anyone realized, the thieves were gone, their digital footprints washed away by time zones and encryption. The world had entered an era where the robberies themselves could vanish, leaving behind only confusion. But behind the technical sophistication, the same old story remained. The digital thief, like his predecessors, was driven by familiar forces: greed, curiosity, frustration, sometimes even justice. Some saw themselves not as criminals but as explorers, pushing against the arrogance of institutions that believed themselves untouchable. In chat rooms and early internet forums, they called themselves freakers or white hats, digital versions of the outlaws who once rode through the Wild West. To them, systems were puzzles, and breaking them was a kind of art. But as the networks grew larger and the stakes higher, the art turned darker. By the turn of the millennium, cybercrime had become an industry. It was organized, calculated, and ruthlessly efficient. Data was the new gold, and banks were no longer the only targets. Payment processors, online retailers, and digital wallets all became part of a vast ecosystem of vulnerability. The term heist evolved. It no longer meant a man with a mask and a plan. It meant code written in silence, executed in milliseconds. A single keystroke could move more wealth than a century of train robberies. And yet something deeper changed too. The distance between thief and victim grew so vast that emotion almost disappeared. In older crimes there had always been confrontation, eyes meeting across a counter, the sound of breath and heartbeat. There was risk, courage, and consequence. In the digital world, theft became cold, almost clinical. It was done with detachment, with no sound, no struggle, no human face. The same tools that connected humanity more closely than ever also made it easier to harm without feeling it. But even as the methods changed, the vulnerabilities stayed painfully human. The weakest link in any system was never the firewall or the code. It was trust, the email that asked for a password, the employee who clicked a link, the administrator who ignored a small anomaly because it seemed too minor to matter. The machines were perfect, the people were not, and that imperfection, multiplied across billions of users, became the largest open vault in history. The technological turn did not end with banks. It spread into governments, corporations, and private lives. Every connection became both a bridge and a door. Every advancement in security became a new challenge for those willing to study it long enough. In this new world, the line between safety and exposure grew thinner with each passing year. The idea of a bank robbery became abstract, almost obsolete. There were no more vaults to crack. There were only networks to understand. In the end, the story of digital theft is not just about machines. It's about the same restless intelligence that drove the first locksmith, the same curiosity that watched trains full of gold disappear into the night. Technology didn't invent greed, it only gave it speed. And as the 20th century drew to a close, the world found itself standing at a strange intersection, one where the future of money was light and the future of crime was invisible. The heists to come would not echo with footsteps or gunfire. They would hum quietly through fiber optics, unfolding faster than thought, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint pulse of loss buried deep inside a network. What was once stolen by hand would now be stolen by code. The locks had changed, but the hunger behind them had not. Chapter 11: The Central Bank Heists. Power often hides behind quiet doors. It doesn't shout or glitter. It hums, steady and invisible, deep inside the walls of buildings that most people will never enter. Among these, the central banks of the world hold the greatest silence of all. They are the heartbeats of economies, guarded, regulated, and trusted without question. But where money concentrates, curiosity always follows. And in the late 20th century, that curiosity turned into something bolder. The thieves who once cracked safes and tunneled through dirt began to reach for something grander. They set their sights on the vaults that held nations. It was 1987 in London, a city both old and restless, where fog still drifted through streets lined with glass towers. In the wealthy district of Knightsbridge, a man named Valerio Vixi walked into the Knightsbridge Safe Deposit Center with an air of calm belonging. He was Italian, young, impeccably dressed, and confident in the way only someone who has already broken the rules of life can be. He wasn't there to deposit anything. He was there to take everything. The Knightsbridge Center was not a bank in the traditional sense. It was a vault for the rich, a collection of private safes rented by businessmen, socialites, and collectors who preferred discretion. Paintings, diamonds, documents, cash. Each box was a secret, sealed behind steel and quiet trust. Vixi understood this kind of world. He had been stealing from it for years. But Knightsbridge would be different. It would be his masterpiece. He didn't storm the vault. He charmed his way into it. Posing as a customer, he opened a safety deposit box in advance, gaining access to the inner rooms. Then, on the morning of July 12, 1987, he returned with an accomplice. They subdued the guards, locked the front doors, and hung a simple sign outside, closed for the day. Inside, they worked patiently, opening box after box, filling bags with cash, gold, and jewels. For hours, London moved above them, unaware that one of the largest heists in its history was unfolding beneath its feet. By the time they left, more than 60 million had vanished. The vault looked like a battlefield of broken locks and open drawers, a quiet aftermath of order undone. Vixi escaped to South America, where he lived lavishly, almost proudly. His story spread like legend, the Italian playboy who robbed London and got away. But legend always attracts attention. A year later, lured back by the promise of retrieving his beloved Ferrari, he was captured. Even then, he smiled in his mugshot. A man who had lost the gold, but kept the story. If the Knightsbridge heist belonged to the age of glamour, what followed belonged to the age of systems. The 1990s brought global finance, digital networks, and a new kind of opportunity. The Dunbar armored robbery of 1997 in Los Angeles was not elegant or symbolic, it was surgical. Inside a warehouse where cash from hundreds of banks was processed each night, a man named Alan Pace worked as a trusted employee. He studied the patterns, cameras, shifts, alarms. Not as a thief, but as someone who simply wanted to understand them. Over time, understanding became temptation. Pace was intelligent, quiet, and careful. He knew that stealing from the outside was nearly impossible, but from the inside the fortress looked different. He planned for months, timing his moves to the second. On the night of September 12, 1997, with 5 friends, he entered the facility using his key and knowledge of the blind spots. They disabled cameras, restrained the guards, and loaded the waiting truck with cash. In just 30 minutes, they had taken $18.9 million. The largest cash heist in American history at the time. When the robbery was discovered, investigators found no forced entry, no alarms triggered, no fingerprints. Only the haunting realization that the enemy had never been outside. The money from the Dunbar heist was hidden, buried in the California hills, passed carefully from hand to hand. Pace lived modestly, drawing little attention. For years, the crime remained unsolved, but human patience has limits. One member of the crew, caught in financial trouble, broke the silence. He turned on the others and the dominoes fell. Pace was arrested in 2001. Most of the cash was never found. The central bank and armored car heists of the late century revealed a truth older than gold, that no system, however powerful, is safe from those who understand it too well. These were not crimes of chaos. They were acts of study. Every motion, every timing, every code was learned through observation. They required not force, but faith. Faith that people would do tomorrow exactly what they did today. Yet beyond the cleverness, these heists spoke to something deeper. They reflected a shift in human ambition, from survival to mastery. The thieves of this era were not simply stealing money. They were proving that the world's grandest systems, built on precision and order, could still be undone by human intuition. It was not rebellion against wealth, but a conversation with it, a challenge whispered in steel and silence. What made these crimes feel almost philosophical was their restraint. There were no gunfights, no hostages, no broken glass scattered across city streets, just quiet planning and execution, followed by the long, slow unraveling that always comes after. The thieves were not villains in the traditional sense. They were architects of imperfection, reminders that even the strongest structures depend on the weakest link. As the millennium approached, the world grew more connected, more dependent on invisible systems. Central banks, once physical symbols of power, became digital engines of trust. Money moved through cables and circuits instead of trucks and guards. The next generation of thieves would no longer need blueprints or maps. They would need access codes, malware, and screens. The battlefield was shifting again, upward, outward, into the invisible. Still, the echoes of the old world remained. Somewhere in the stories of Vixie and Pace, in the scent of steel vaults and the weight of cash, there lingers a certain nostalgia. The kind that remembers when crime still required touch, when the act of stealing felt human, flawed, dangerous, alive. But the world was changing faster than anyone could imagine. In the coming years, theft would shed its last traces of flesh and metal. The robbers would not be seen, their tools would not clang, and their footprints would not mark the floor. They would move through light and code, slipping between systems as unseen as breath. The age of the physical heist was ending. The digital empire was rising. And in that new empire, the stakes would no longer be vaults or gold, but the very fabric of trust itself. Chapter 12: The New Face of Crime. By the early 2000s, the image of the bank robber's mask, the gun, the getaway car had begun to fade like an old photograph. The world had stepped quietly into a new era, one lit by the glow of computer screens and humming servers. Money was no longer something you could hold. It lived as numbers, pulsing through invisible wires, circling the globe at the speed of thought. The doors that once needed to be forced open with crowbars and drills could now be breached with code-tinny strings of logic capable of unraveling entire institutions. The thief no longer had to risk his life. He only had to risk his connection. The new face of crime was invisible. It was patient. It spoke in algorithms and encryption. It could live anywhere, travel nowhere, and reach everywhere. From cramped apartments in Eastern Europe to quiet cafes in Singapore, a new generation of thieves learned to steal not by breaking in, but by logging on. They called themselves hackers, and unlike the outlaws before them, they didn't chase cash that clinked or glimmered. They stole information because in this new world, information was money. The first signs of the shift came in whispers, isolated breaches, unexplained transfers, strange patterns in accounts. In the early 2000s, small banks began reporting electronic thefts that seemed impossible to trace. Entire balances vanished in seconds, redirected to offshore accounts. A misplaced keystroke could cost millions. The perpetrators were rarely caught because they were rarely anywhere at all. The internet had dissolved geography. A hacker in one country could rob a bank across the ocean, hide behind false identities, and disappear into the digital crowd. The world's oldest crime had finally gone global. One of the early legends of this era was a man known only as Albert Gonzalez, a figure who became both ghost and symbol. In the mid-2000s, Gonzalez orchestrated one of the largest credit card theft operations in history. He didn't storm vaults or cut wires. He simply found weaknesses. Using SQL injection attacks, a digital trick that slides malicious code into website-ish, breached the databases of major retailers and financial institutions. Over several years, his team stole more than 170 million credit card numbers. Entire economies of fraud sprang from their work: cloned cards, resold identities, phantom transactions. Gonzalez lived quietly in Miami, enjoying luxury that left no trace until he was caught in 2008, undone not by force but by trust. He had been working as an informant for the U.S. Secret Service, betraying both sides without realizing that in the digital world, every secret eventually loops back. But Gonzalez was just the beginning. As computers grew smarter, so did the crimes. By the 2010s, organized groups had replaced lone hackers. These new syndicates were structured like corporations, complete with hierarchies, customer service lines, and 24-hour help desks for stolen data. Their operations had names, logos, and business models. Ransomware became their most profitable invention. Instead of breaking into a system and stealing, the hackers would lock it down, encrypt every file, and demand payment in cryptocurrency to restore it. Hospitals, universities, government offices, none were immune. One careless click on an email attachment could paralyze an entire city. The irony was painful. The very technology that promised to make the world safer and more connected had become the perfect weapon for isolation and fear. The bank robberies of the past had targets and boundaries. The cyber heists of this new age had none. A virus unleashed in one country could ripple across continents within hours, infecting systems that no one had ever meant to touch. Crime had lost its edges. In 2014, the world watched as a group called Lazarus emerged from the shadows. Believed to be state-sponsored, they executed attacks not for greed alone, but for power. They stole millions from banks, corporations, even movie studios. Their code was their weapon, their reach untraceable. One of their most ambitious acts came 2 years later, the Bangladesh bank hack, where they used stolen credentials to infiltrate the SWIFT banking network, redirecting nearly $1 billion through international transfers. They succeeded in stealing 81 million before a spelling error in one of the transfer orders, a simple type-triggered suspicion, and stopped the rest. It was proof of how fragile the digital world truly was. The future of theft could depend not on guns or guards, but on a misplaced letter. This new era blurred more than methods, it blurred morality. Some hackers became vigilantes, breaking into systems not for money, but to expose flaws. They called themselves ethical hackers, but even they existed in a gray world. When you can break into anything, who decides what's right to fix and what's right to steal? Others worked for governments, their skills turned into tools of espionage. Cybercrime became cyberwar, a quiet conflict fought in data centers instead of battlefields. The same technology that allowed a teenager to drain a bank account could also bring down power grids or silence entire cities. In this new landscape, banks fought back not with thicker walls, but with smarter minds. They built armies of analysts, algorithms that could detect anomalies in fractions of a second. Artificial intelligence became the new security guard, scanning millions of transactions for patterns no human could see. Yet even AI had a weakness: it learned from human behavior, and human behavior could be mimicked. Deepfake voices began to appear in fraud cases, synthetic speech convincing employees to transfer funds or reveal passwords. It was no longer enough to know who someone sounded like. You had to know if they were real at all. The new face of crime didn't belong to any one person or place. It was a network of minds, constantly shifting, constantly adapting. It was as fluid as money itself. In one sense, this evolution was inevitable. Every age of progress creates its counterpart in age of exploitation. The train gave rise to the train robber. The computer gave rise to the hacker. Each invention carries within it a shadow, waiting for someone patient enough to study it long enough to see where the light ends. Yet behind all the technology, the same human story continued. The desire for more, the thrill of risk, the belief that cleverness could outwit order. Even in the digital age, theft remained strangely personal. It was still about controlled power to take what the world said you couldn't. The same heartbeat that pulsed through the veins of the man tunneling under a London bank now pulsed through the fingers of someone typing in a dark room thousands of miles away. The world would never again return to the simplicity of vaults and safes. The new criminals didn't carry guns and they didn't leave fingerprints. They carried code, and their fingerprints were made of light. As the 21st century unfolded, banks and nations learned a truth older than gold, that the real battleground for wealth was no longer physical at all. It was everywhere and nowhere, a silent struggle between those who built systems and those who understood how to unbuild them. And in that quiet struggle, one thing became clear. The perfect heist of the future would not require breaking into a place. It would require breaking into an idea. Chapter 13: The Bangladesh Bank Hack. It began with a few lines of code. Nothing visible, nothing loud. No alarms sounded, no doors broke, no guards stirred in the night. Yet in the quiet hours of February 2016, a small set of commands started moving through the digital arteries of the world's financial system. They were written not in anger or desperation, but with a calm precision that mirrored the heists of another era, a kind of modern patience. The thieves did not wear masks or gloves. Their fingerprints were fragments of data, their weapons invisible. Their target was not a vault filled with gold, but a place where numbers themselves became treasure, the Central Bank of Bangladesh. At first glance, the Bangladesh Bank seemed unremarkable. A beige government building in Dhaka, humming softly with fluorescent light. Inside, the hum of air conditioners blended with the whir of desktop computers. Clerks moved paper forms between desks, and ceiling fans turned lazily against the heat. Few would have imagined that this quiet institution sat on billions in foreign reserves, held in accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Yet it did. The bank managed the lifeblood of a nation, money that kept imports flowing, debt paid, and wages stable. In a connected world, this small building in Dhaka was tied directly to the beating heart of the global financial network. The hackers understood that connection better than anyone. They had studied the system for months, maybe years, learning how messages traveled through SWIFT, the secure network that central banks and commercial institutions used to transfer funds across the globe. To most people, SWIFT was a symbol of trust, a digital vault that had never truly been breached. But like every vault, it was not the metal that mattered. It was the people and processes that surrounded it. Somewhere buried inside Bangladesh Bank's network was a weak link waiting to be found. The attackers entered quietly, likely through a phishing email, a simple message that fooled an employee into opening a file that should never have been opened. Inside that file hid malware, designed not to destroy but to observe. For weeks it watched how the bank worked. It learned the daily routines, the formats of SWIFT messages, the timing of transfers. It recorded everything, patient and invisible, until it knew exactly how to impersonate the bank itself. On the night of February 4th, a Friday, the staff went home as usual. Friday is the weekend in Bangladesh, a day of rest, but in the servers left running overnight, the code woke up. The attackers began sending messages to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, not from outside, but from within the Bangladesh bank's own system. They instructed the Fed to move money, nearly $1 billion, from the bank's account into accounts in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. The requests were formatted perfectly, written in the same language and structure used every day by real transactions. To the Fed's computers, it looked entirely legitimate. 35 transfer requests were sent. 5 were processed before anyone noticed. The first 4 transfers, totaling $81 million, made it through. The 5th, a request for $20 million to a foundation in Sri Lanka, contained one small mistake, a single word spelled incorrectly, foundation written as fandation. A simple human error, the kind no machine could predict, became the thread that saved hundreds of millions. The Federal Reserve grew suspicious, halted the remaining transactions, and began investigating. But by then, the $81 million had already vanished into the labyrinth of the global financial system. The money flowed swiftly to the Philippines through accounts at a small commercial bank. From there, it was converted into pesos and passed through local casinos, an unregulated space where gambling chips and cash mingled freely. Within days, the trail grew cold. The funds were laundered, washed through games of chance, and emerged as clean as if they had never been touched. When the Bangladesh bank opened on Saturday morning, the clerks found the printers silent. Normally, the SWIFT terminal printed confirmation receipts automatically, a comforting rhythm of paper and ink, but the printers had been disabled. When they were restarted, the pages that came out were filled with strange transactions, names and destinations no one recognized. Panic spread quickly through the office. By the time they contacted the Federal Reserve, it was too late. The heist was already complete. The investigation that followed felt like something out of science fiction. Forensic teams traced the code across continents, from Dhaka to Manila, from Manila to Malaysia and beyond. The malware used in the attack bore the hallmarks of a group known as Lazarus, the same collective suspected in earlier cyberattacks against major corporations and governments. Their origins were traced to North Korea, though confirmation remained elusive. What was certain was their sophistication. They had studied not only the SWIFT system but human behavior itself. The timing of weekends, the assumptions of trust, the invisibility of routine. The Bangladesh bank hack was unlike anything the world had seen. It wasn't just a theft of money, it was a theft of confidence. It revealed that the systems believed to be unbreakable could be bent from within. A central bank, the very symbol of stability, had been robbed not by force but by mimicry. The criminals had pretended to be the system itself, and for a moment the world had believed them. In the aftermath, the stolen funds became almost secondary. What mattered was the realization of vulnerability. If one central bank could be breached, could others? If $1 billion could nearly disappear because of an email and a spelling mistake, what else might already be happening in the quiet corners of the digital world? The idea that money was safe because it was intangible began to crumble. The invisible was not invincible after all. For Bangladesh, the consequences went beyond financial loss. It was humiliation, the exposure of weakness on a global stage. Officials faced scrutiny, questions, and blame. Yet beneath the politics, there lingered a deeper truth. The system they trusted had grown too complex for anyone to truly understand. The wires that connected Dhaka to New York, Manila, and beyond formed a web so intricate that no single person could see all of it. In that blindness, the thieves had found their power. The Bangladesh bank hack marked a threshold, the moment when the digital heist stopped being metaphor and became reality. It wasn't about an individual breaking the law, but about a network understanding another network too well. It was the logical conclusion of a century's evolution of theft, from the train to the vault to the code. Each step stripped away the noise, the violence, the visibility, until all that remained was the act itself, pure, quiet, mathematical. And yet, beneath all that sophistication, the same old human story persisted. Curiosity, desire, the temptation to test the boundaries of trust. Even in the age of machines, it is still people who decide to cross the line. Today, when banks send money through the SWIFT network, they check the messages twice, sometimes 3 times. But the lesson lingers like a shadow. The next breach will not look like the last. Somewhere in a dark room lit by the cold glow of a screen, another set of eyes is watching, waiting, studying. Not with anger, not even with urgency, but with the quiet patience of someone who knows. Every system has a door. And the most dangerous thing about that door is how easy it is to mistake it for trust. Chapter 14: The Human Pattern. Across centuries, from vaults carved in stone to codes written in light, the story of theft has never really changed. The tools have evolved, the methods have shifted, but beneath every lock picked and every system breached lies the same beating heart, the human desire to test the boundaries of control. Each heist, no matter how grand or subtle, has always been a mirror reflecting something back at us. Our hunger, our intelligence, our need to challenge what feels untouchable. The deeper one looks into the history of great bank robberies, the clearer the pattern becomes. These are not merely crimes, they are acts of imagination. They require not only greed but vision, the ability to see the invisible spaces within order, to understand how trust is built and where it begins to fray. The thief, in this sense, is not just a criminal but a student of humanity. He studies repetition, belief, and vulnerability. He watches how people behave when they feel safe, and how easily that safety can be undone. In the earliest days, theft was raw and personal. Men like Edward Smith, the locksmith who opened the city bank in 1831, worked with their hands. They felt the weight of metal, the warmth of breath in a dark room. Their courage was physical, their escape depended on muscle and nerve. As time passed, others came with more daring. The bandits on horseback, the outlaws who made robbery a kind of theater. Jesse James and his gang didn't just steal, they performed rebellion. They turned their crimes into legend because their world was hungry for stories of defiance. Then came the thinkers, the planners, the architects of precision, the men who studied schedules, blueprints, and patterns until the world became a puzzle they could solve. The Brinks job, the Great Train robbery, the Baker Street vault. Each was built not on chaos but on control. They were not attacks against systems but conversations with them. The robbers asked, in their own way, a question society rarely dares to face: how much of what we call order is just an illusion? Technology didn't change that question. It only changed the tools used to ask it. The hackers of the digital age, from Vladimir Levin's keystrokes in the 1990s to the Lazarus Group's global heists decades later, were not so different from the thieves who once tunneled under London. They still depended on observation, patience, and nerve. Their landscapes were screens instead of cities, their weapons invisible, but their motivations were ancient, to prove that perfection doesn't exist. To see if they could step through the cracks in the world's most trusted systems and come out clean on the other side. And yet, in studying these crimes, one sees another, softer pattern, not of ambition, but of fragility. Every theft begins where something human falters. A tired clerk clicks the wrong link. A security guard trusts a familiar face. A programmer reuses a password. The failure is rarely mechanical. It is emotional. We design systems to protect us from others, but rarely from ourselves. And that, more than any vault door or encryption key, has always been the true weakness. The fascination with heists has never been about money. It has always been about the act of reaching. The vault, the train, the digital wire. They are metaphors for limits, for the walls we build between what is possible and what is forbidden. To watch those walls fall, even in fiction, stirs something in us. It's not approval we feel, it's recognition. We understand, on some level, the temptation to test the world's edges, to ask whether safety is real or only believed in because we need it to be. There's a moment that exists in every great heist, described the same way by those who have survived it. It's not the moment of planning or of breaking in or even of escape. It's the silence in between, the breath held in the space between success and discovery. That moment, they say, is pure clarity. Time slows, and for a heartbeat, the world feels entirely theirs. The laws of man and money seem to dissolve. It is freedom, but only for an instant. Afterward comes fear, then guilt, then consequence. But that single heartbeat, that's what they chase. It's the same heartbeat that drove inventors to create, explorers to sail, and empires to expand. It's the same pulse that moves both creation and destruction. In that way, the thief and the builder are not opposites. They are reflections of the same instinct, to see structure and wonder what lies beyond it. The builder builds to strengthen, the thief breaks to test. both reveal truth. The difference is only in direction. And perhaps that is why the story of theft never truly leaves us. It is not a story of villains and victims, but of curiosity and consequence. In the modern world, the pattern has become more abstract but no less human. The thieves of today no longer touch what they take. Their crimes unfold in silence, their victories invisible, but the essence remains. The reach for what the world has said cannot be reached. The pattern of ambition, followed by arrogance, followed by downfall, repeats itself in loops across generations. Each age believes it has built the unbreakable system, and each age meets the person who proves otherwise. There's something poetic about that repetition, as if human progress always carries its own undoing. Every wall built to keep danger out eventually becomes a challenge for someone clever enough to see through it. The cycle isn't born from malice but from motion. As long as we create, there will be those who question what we've created. As long as we trust, there will be those who test that trust. It is not cynicism, it is balance. When we look back at the long history of heists, from the flicker of candlelight in a 19th century bank to the cold glow of a modern server room, we're not just seeing crime, we're seeing the evolution of desire. The tools have grown sharper, the stakes higher, but the soul of the act remains the same. It's not about the gold or the money or the code. It's about the simple, stubborn idea that nothing is beyond reach. And maybe that's why these stories linger, not because they celebrate crime, but because they reveal something we'd rather not admit. The line between creativity and corruption, between innovation and intrusion, is thinner than we like to believe. The same curiosity that writes code to protect can also write code to exploit. The same intelligence that builds a bank can find a way to empty it. The same human mind that dreams of progress also dreams of testing its limits. This is the human pattern, the eternal dance between order and the impulse to defy it. Every lock is followed by a key. Every safeguard inspires a challenge. Every certainty invites a question. And in that endless rhythm, creation, resistance, consequence, lies the quiet truth of our species. We build because we must, we test because we can, and we tell stories of both because somewhere in the space between them we find ourselves. Chapter 15: What We Steal For. Every story about money is, in the end, a story about longing. Beneath the weight of coins, the glow of screens, and the hum of vaults lies something simpler. A quiet human ache for control, for safety, for more time in a world that keeps slipping through our fingers. The history of theft, from the first quiet key turned in a 19th century lock to the code that now moves through invisible networks, is not only about greed, it is about desire. The desire to change one's place in a world divided by walls. The great heists we've traced through centuries were never just about wealth. They were about the people who looked at what others said was impossible and asked, "Why not me?" The man who dug under Baker Street was chasing not just gold, but the thrill of mastery. The outlaw who stopped a train was not only after its treasure, but after a story that would make him more than forgotten dust. The hackers who broke into the world's financial networks did so, perhaps, not only for profit, but to prove that even the largest systems are built on fragile trust. In their own flawed ways, they were all reaching for the same thing: power over uncertainty. Because money, for all its symbols and systems, has always been about control, it promises order in a world that never stays still. It turns effort into value, hours into comfort, chaos into calculation. And yet, even as we build walls around it, something in us can't resist the urge to test those walls. We are drawn to edges, to the space between safety and risk, between morality and ambition. The act of stealing, stripped of its cruelty, is an act of curiosity twisted inward. It asks, how far can a person go before the world pushes back? In the earliest days, the thief's world was small and visible. The prize was tangible, the danger close. A wrong move meant capture, a gun, a gallows, but as the centuries passed, distance grew. The modern thief rarely meets his victim, rarely sees the face behind the loss. He sits in a room, his eyes lit by a monitor, his hands steady, his breathing quiet. He moves digits instead of gold. And yet, for all the change, the feeling is the same. The pulse quickens, the air thickens. Somewhere beneath logic and code, the same animal instinct stirs. The need to prove that the system can be outthought, that the walls of control are still breakable. But if theft reveals the limits of our systems, it also exposes the limits of our hearts. Because what we steal for says more about who we are than what we build. Some steal for survival. The desperate, the cornered, the hungry. Some steal for pride. To show the world that they could, that intelligence could outmatch power. And some steal because they no longer believe in fairness, because they've seen too many rules bent for others. Too many promises kept for the powerful and broken for the poor. In their own warped logic, theft becomes a kind of rebellion, not against money itself, but against what money represents: distance, hierarchy, exclusion. There's a strange symmetry in it, for as long as humans have created wealth, they've also created inequality. And wherever inequality grows, theft follows like a shadow. It's not a justification, but a reflection. A mirror held up to a system that never quite distributes what it creates. Every great heist, in its quiet way, asks a moral question the world prefers not to answer: who really owns what? And yet, for all the philosophy we can attach to it, the aftermath of every theft looks the same. Someone loses, someone hides, someone pays the cost. The stolen gold is melted, the stolen data erased, the stolen time never returned. Even the cleverest plans decay with age. Most thieves, no matter how brilliant, end up not with riches but with isolation. They learn that what they took doesn't stay taken for long. Money fades, fame turns bitter, and even victory becomes a kind of loneliness. The act that once felt like freedom becomes its own prison. Still, the stories endure, not because we admire the thieves, but because they expose something raw in the human condition. The heist is a story about boundaries, between right and wrong, need and greed, courage and folly. And it is also a story about imagination, the belief that the world can be rearranged, even for a moment, by the force of one's will. In that sense, every theft is a distorted echo of creativity. Both begin with the same spark: what if? Perhaps that is why we keep returning to these tales. To the quiet banker's key, the outlaws on the rails, the tunnels under London, the flicker of a cursor on a hacker's screen. Each one shows us something about our species that we cannot look away from. We are builders and breakers, dreamers and doubters. We create systems to feel safe, then challenge them to feel alive. We crave structure, but worship the thrill of its collapse. The story of theft is simply the story of how deeply we want to feel that we can still change the rules, even when we know we shouldn't. But underneath the rebellion, beneath the risk and the glory, something else hides, something quieter. A thief is never truly chasing wealth. Wealth is only the measure of something deeper, something unspoken. They are chasing meaning. The feeling that life, however brief or unfair, can still be bent by their own hands, that they can take back a measure of control in a world that so often decides for them. And maybe that's what connects every story in this long chain of human ambition, the need to be seen, to leave a mark, to rewrite the narrative for a single heartbeat. Some do it by building banks, others by breaking them, but both are driven by the same longing, to not be small in the face of the vast, indifferent world that money pretends to order. When you strip away the tools, the keys, the drills, the machines, the code, what remains is a single question that has followed humanity from the first stolen coin to the last digital heist. What are we really trying to take? It's rarely the money itself, it's the feeling behind it, the security it promises, the freedom it suggests, the idea that there is a place beyond fear, beyond hunger, beyond dependence. In that sense, every theft, like every act of creation, is a search for peace, a misguided, fleeting attempt to touch something we've been chasing for centuries. And so, as the world grows quieter, as wealth becomes less visible and more abstract, the story continues. The players change, the tools evolve, but the rhythm remains, the same heartbeat under different skies. Because whether we build the systems or break them, we are still the same restless creatures, forever reaching beyond our limits, forever mistaking what we want for what we can take. Maybe that is the oldest truth of all. We don't steal for gold or numbers or even power. We steal for the illusion that, just for a moment, we might finally feel complete. And then, as always, the silence returns. The world goes on. The locks are changed. The money moves again. And somewhere, someone new begins to wonder, how far could they go before the world notices? That is the final echo of every great heist. Not the sound of the vault closing, but the question that never stops opening.